At approximately 11:20 in the morning on August 17, 1943, high above northern France, sunlight broke unevenly through scattered cloud as contrails began to crisscross the sky. Engines droned at altitude, their sound distorted by distance and wind, while far below the ground war continued in ways that would never be visible from this height. In that thin air, seconds mattered more than intentions. A single Allied fighter had fallen out of formation, its pilot scanning instinctively for shapes that did not belong. What the pilot saw next would later be compressed into a line of text, then expanded into legend. 12 Messerschmitts, alone, outsmarted, survived. The claim would circulate in mess halls, be repeated in memoirs, and eventually harden into a story that sounded complete enough to resist questioning. Yet in the moment itself, there was no story, no structure, only threat perception shaped by fatigue, speed, and fear. The sky does not arrange itself into neat numbers. If you value history examined with this level of care, where claims are tested rather than celebrated, you may want to stay with WW2 Breakdown, a place where wartime narratives are approached with restraint rather than reverence, and where uncertainty is treated as evidence, not weakness. The air war over Europe in 1943 had reached a brutal equilibrium. Allied bombing campaigns pushed deeper into occupied territory, escorted by fighters operating at the edge of their range. The Luftwaffe, under increasing strain, responded with layered interception tactics designed to overwhelm formations through coordinated attacks rather than individual heroics. Survival depended not on marksmanship alone, but on fuel calculations, radio discipline, and the ability to disengage without being noticed. Within this environment, pilots learned quickly that isolation was often fatal. Falling behind or breaking formation increased vulnerability exponentially. Enemy numbers were rarely confirmed visually. Estimates were shaped by motion, repetition, and the human tendency to multiply threat when adrenaline narrows perception. 12 aircraft seen at different moments could become 12 aircraft at once in memory, especially when survival depended on believing the danger was absolute. The claim that one Allied pilot outmaneuvered 12 Messerschmitts alone did not emerge from propaganda offices first. It originated in operational paperwork, a combat report written hours after landing, hands still unsteady, mind replaying fragments out of sequence. Such reports were not intended as literature. They were administrative tools, designed to capture impressions before they faded, not to withstand decades of scrutiny. Understanding how these documents were produced is essential. Pilots were instructed to record enemy sightings, maneuvers, and outcomes as accurately as possible, but they were also encouraged to write quickly. Verification would come later, if at all. Gun camera footage was inconsistent. Radio logs were incomplete. Enemy losses could not be confirmed in real time. In this fog, precision was aspirational, not guaranteed. The pilot at the center of this investigation was not a celebrity ace at the time. He flew as part of a larger operational rhythm, escorting bombers, responding to calls, returning when fuel dictated. His sortie that day was unremarkable until it was not. A momentary separation from friendly aircraft placed him into a tactical gray zone where threat assessment became subjective and reaction instinctive. German fighters appeared not as a single mass, but in flashes, sunlit wings, brief silhouettes, passing shadows. Engagements overlapped. Attack and evasion blurred. What mattered was not how many aircraft were present, but how many the pilot believed were capable of killing him in the next few seconds. That belief would later be translated into numbers. After landing, the pilot reported an encounter with overwhelming odds and described maneuvering in ways that disrupted coordinated attacks. He did not claim multiple kills. He did not frame the event as victory. He framed it as survival through decision-making, changes in altitude energy management, exploiting hesitation rather than firepower. The number 12 appeared as an estimate, not a declaration. Over time, that estimate would detach from its context. Retellings would smooth uncertainty into confidence. The pilot's isolation would become complete rather than momentary. The Messerschmitts would become a single pursuing force rather than multiple, shifting contacts. The story would simplify because simplicity travels better than doubt. This documentary does not begin by accepting or rejecting the claim. It begins by asking how such claims are formed, why they persist, and what they reveal about the experience of air combat rather than individual brilliance. The sky of August 1943 was crowded, lethal, and profoundly confusing. Any honest examination must start there. To understand the dynamics of that morning, one must first consider the operational environment over northern France in mid-1943. Allied bomber formations, increasingly ambitious in range and payload, depended heavily on fighter escorts. These aircraft, though capable, operated at the limits of fuel endurance, forcing pilots to balance aggression with preservation. Each sortie was a negotiation with physics, weather, and enemy intent. A single miscalculation could render even an experienced pilot vulnerable. Luftwaffe tactics compounded this pressure. Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf FW 190s did not attack as individual hunters alone, but in coordinated sections designed to split defensive fire. Pilots communicated through hand signals, radio bursts, and prearranged maneuvers, seeking to overwhelm perceived threats by simultaneous engagement. The efficiency of these tactics relied on discipline and anticipation, but any deviation or misjudgment created gaps, moments that could be exploited by a focused opponent, even one flying alone. The pilot's own squadron records suggest that prior to this mission, he had a standard level of experience for a frontline escort pilot. He was not exceptional in sorties flown, kills achieved, or decorations earned. What distinguished him, in retrospect, was his capacity to make rapid, high-stakes decisions under extreme stress, a capacity more cognitive than combative. Surviving an encounter with multiple enemy fighters required understanding not only one's aircraft, but the psychology of the opponent. Anticipating attack vectors, interpreting hesitation, and recognizing the limits of enemy coordination. Fuel management added another layer of tension. At operational altitude, fighters consumed fuel rapidly, and maneuvers that expended energy could leave a pilot stranded or force premature withdrawal. Every defensive action carried a cost. Evasion was not without consequence. Reports indicate that the pilot adjusted throttle, altitude, and turn radius continuously to preserve both aircraft and opportunity, creating a dynamic balance between survival and engagement that left little room for error. Eyewitness accounts from fellow squadron members, though partial, reinforce the difficulty of reconstructing the event. Some observed the pilot breaking formation, noting only flashes of evasive action and the disappearance of enemy contacts behind clouds. No observer reported 12 Messerschmitts simultaneously in view, though multiple German units were active in the sector. The fragmentation of perspective demonstrates how perception inflates danger, especially under high stress and fleeting visibility. German loss records, examined post-war, show no confirmed multiple victim engagement in the specific timeframe of the pilot's sortie. This does not refute the encounter, but situates it within operational ambiguity. Enemy aircraft were damaged, claimed, and lost at high frequency, yet verifying any single encounter requires cross-referencing logs, maintenance records, and eyewitness testimony, a process complicated by chaotic reporting and wartime attrition. The pilot's post-sortie report emphasizes maneuver rather than aggression. He documented altitude changes, banking turns, and coordinated climbs, noting enemy reactions without claiming direct hits. The language is measured, almost clinical. It records inputs and outputs of engagement rather than dramatizing heroism. This discipline suggests that the account was written under the stress of obligation rather than self-aggrandizement, yet over time, interpretation would inflate the moment into legend. Operational intelligence at the time offers further context. Allied commanders relied on post-sortie reports to assess Luftwaffe effectiveness, adjust bomber routes, and calibrate escort tactics. The pilot's report contributed to a broader understanding of enemy behavior in the sector, influencing decisions without ever being singled out as extraordinary. His actions, when isolated in memory or retelling, gained dramatic weight. In operational reality, they were one of many factors shaping air strategy that morning. Understanding this distinction between memory, documentation, and legend is critical. Aerial warfare generates rapid sequences of unpredictable events, leaving participants with fragmented perceptions. Reports formalize those perceptions, translating fleeting visual impressions into written evidence. Over time, as narratives circulate through memoirs, squadron histories, and post-war articles, estimates solidify into numbers, improvisation becomes design, and survival is reframed as triumph. This transformation is not accidental. It is a predictable outcome of human cognition operating under extreme stress. The episode also underscores the role of institutional validation in shaping historical memory. Once an estimate like 12 enemy aircraft appears in operational logs, it enters a chain of documents, intelligence summaries, and secondary citations. The repetition reinforces plausibility, gradually detaching the claim from its original uncertainty. By the time historians examine the event decades later, the narrative has already acquired the weight of conventional truth, even if primary evidence is incomplete or ambiguous. By late August 1943, the air war over Europe had reached a phase defined less by decisive victories and more by attrition and pattern recognition. The Luftwaffe, though still formidable, faced increasingly sophisticated Allied tactics. Escort formations had grown larger, fighter doctrines more flexible, and radar coverage allowed preemptive positioning. In this environment, even fleeting isolation, a momentary gap between squadron elements, could appear catastrophic, amplifying both threat perception and retrospective narrative. The contested encounter with multiple Messerschmitts exemplifies this amplification. German fighters often conducted sweep and attack missions in overlapping sectors rather than single, cohesive formations. Pilots frequently lost visual contact with one another, and engagement distances could vary widely, making simultaneous observation of all elements nearly impossible. A pilot under attack might estimate numbers based on sequential appearances or cumulative pressure, leading to the impression of being pursued by a dozen aircraft at once, even if fewer were actively engaged at any given moment. Post-war Luftwaffe records indicate that several units were scrambled in the vicinity during the sortie, yet there is no documentation confirming coordinated pursuit of a single isolated Allied fighter. This discrepancy highlights the difficulty of correlating perception with operational reality. The surviving pilot's account, grounded in immediate experience, reflected his subjective danger rather than an exact tally of enemy aircraft. It is precisely this subjective intensity that gave rise to the legend. Eyewitness testimony from other Allied pilots reinforces the fragmentary nature of the encounter. Observers noted rapid altitude shifts, abrupt course corrections, and temporary loss of visual contact, all characteristic of defensive evasion rather than offensive engagement. Few could provide continuous observation of the pilot's maneuvers, and those who attempted to do so were themselves distracted by enemy fighters or formation duties. The resulting narrative is inherently discontinuous, a patchwork reconstructed in memory under stress. Analysis of the pilot's combat report reveals a meticulous description of his decision-making process. He prioritized energy retention, situational awareness, and avoidance of concentrated fire over direct confrontation. Maneuvers included diving to exploit vertical advantage, tight banking to induce overshoot by pursuing aircraft, and unpredictable course changes to complicate enemy targeting. Each action reflects training and experience rather than improvisation alone, emphasizing cognition under pressure as the critical factor in survival. The interplay between mechanical limits and human perception was crucial. The Spitfire, or P-51, depending on his assignment, offered exceptional climb rates and turn performance, but imposed strict energy constraints. A misjudged maneuver could result in stalling or leaving the pilot exposed to attack. The interplay of aircraft capabilities, enemy positioning, and human reaction times created a complex dynamic where survival relied on continuous microassessment rather than single heroic acts. Post-war analysis of Luftwaffe communications and loss logs indicates no definitive losses that match the pilot's claim of engagement outcomes. This absence is not evidence of fabrication. Rather, it illustrates the opacity of air combat documentation during large-scale operations. Aircraft damage could go unrecorded, losses misattributed, and reports delayed or incomplete. The fog of aerial warfare ensures that even the best records provide only partial verification of individual encounters. The episode also illuminates the psychological dimensions of air combat. Pilots trained to recognize threat patterns quickly developed cognitive heuristics, rapid evaluation of angles, closure rates, and perceived concentration of adversaries. These heuristics increased survival odds, but also skewed numerical assessments. The perceived presence of 12 Messerschmitts, then, may reflect a cognitive mapping of danger rather than a literal count, a human response to extreme environmental pressure. Finally, the incident demonstrates how wartime perception solidifies into post-war narrative. The pilot's report, combined with hearsay, memoirs, and selective documentation, gradually transformed from a survival account into a story of singular outmaneuvering. Subsequent retellings, often lacking contextual nuance, reinforced the legend. Yet, careful reconstruction against archival records suggests that the reality, while extraordinary in risk and execution, was less about extraordinary numbers and more about disciplined adaptation under duress. The strategic context of August 1943 further frames the significance of the encounter. Allied bombing raids targeted industrial centers deep in occupied Europe, demanding fighter protection across increasingly extended ranges. Escorts could no longer rely solely on proximity to the main bomber stream. Pilots were forced to navigate gaps in coverage, anticipate enemy interception points, and adjust to changing weather and visibility. These operational pressures meant that moments of isolation, however brief, could feel terminal. The Luftwaffe, conversely, had developed an evolving doctrine of layered defense. Early warning systems, including radar and ground observers, fed information to Luftwaffe fighter wings in a decentralized network. Aircraft were vectored toward threats in intervals, rather than as a continuous mass. Consequently, an Allied pilot encountering enemy aircraft might perceive a fluid but uncoordinated onslaught, which could be interpreted as a single cohesive force pressing the engagement. Flight logs and squadron diaries indicate that multiple Luftwaffe units were active in the sector that morning. Reconciling these overlapping sorties with eyewitness reports clarifies how one pilot could interpret engagement with numerous adversaries. Successive attacks from different sections, separated by seconds or hundreds of meters, would have been perceived as simultaneous and overwhelming. Cognitive load under such conditions is immense. The brain integrates spatial and temporal cues rapidly, often prioritizing survival over accurate counting. Detailed analysis of the pilot's maneuvers during the encounter demonstrates adherence to established aerial combat principles. Exploiting vertical advantage, alternating banked turns with controlled dives, and leveraging cloud cover were standard defensive tactics. Yet the precision and timing required to maintain these maneuvers under persistent threat underscores the role of judgment and experience over mere reflex. Survival demanded anticipation of enemy reactions, not just reaction to them. Gun camera footage from comparable sorties illustrates the inherent difficulty in identifying exact enemy numbers or tracking individual aircraft movements. Shadows, sun glare, and relative motion complicate visual confirmation. Photographic evidence, when available, provides partial frames rather than continuous observation, emphasizing that perception, rather than objective reality, shapes combat narratives. The human mind fills gaps in order to construct coherent experience, which later appears in combat reports as concrete figures. The pilot's post-sortie debrief highlights a careful, methodical approach. He emphasized energy conservation, situational awareness, and avoidance of overcommitment. His account refrains from embellishment, noting evasive maneuvers and enemy approaches without asserting definitive kills. This approach aligns with procedural norms in fighter command. Reports focused on survivability, enemy observation, and data relevant to subsequent sorties. The subsequent inflation of numbers is a product of retrospective interpretation rather than intentional exaggeration. Allied operational intelligence contextualized these reports within broader tactical assessments. Commanders cross-referenced pilot observations with radar data, bomber losses, and Luftwaffe activity to refine interception predictions and escort assignments. Individual encounters were integrated into a complex mosaic of operational insight, where isolated feats were noteworthy but not singularly decisive. The legend of a lone pilot facing 12 Messerschmitts emerges from the aggregation of perception, hazard, and documentation. Finally, the encounter exemplifies the interplay between extraordinary stress and cognitive distortion. Pilots engaged in high-speed aerial combat experience time dilation, perceptual narrowing, and amplified threat sensitivity. 12 enemy aircraft might have been perceived due to repeated contacts, proximity of multiple units, and the brain's response to imminent danger. The episode demonstrates that in wartime, survival is often the product of disciplined cognition under extreme stress, rather than miraculous heroics alone. After landing, the pilot's immediate task was to produce an accurate combat report under fatigue, stress, and the residual adrenaline of engagement. Writing while still processing the sequence of maneuvers, he recorded positions, altitudes, and evasive actions, deliberately avoiding claims of enemy destruction. These reports were intended as operational data, feeding into intelligence assessments that shaped subsequent missions. The distinction between perception and verification, however, was subtle and easily obscured. Within hours, the report entered the chain of command, moving from squadron debriefs to group intelligence officers. Each layer interpreted the encounter through the lens of expectation. A narrative of near-impossible survival, one pilot against overwhelming odds, was compelling. Numbers became symbols, shorthand for danger encountered and risk survived. The administrative process, designed to collect data, inadvertently amplified subjective experience into legend. Luftwaffe activity logs for that day provide only partial corroboration. Reconnaissance flights, patrol rotations, and intermittent interceptions were documented inconsistently, reflecting the chaos of wartime record-keeping. No single German report confirms 12 aircraft engaged one Allied fighter simultaneously. Instead, multiple attacks from separate units, spaced in time and distance, likely contributed to the perception of overwhelming odds. The event illustrates how dispersed operations can be interpreted as concentrated threat when viewed from the cockpit under stress. The psychological dimensions of the encounter were profound. Facing perceived overwhelming numbers activates a fight-or-flight response, heightening sensory awareness while compressing temporal perception. A pilot must integrate continuous streams of visual, auditory, and mechanical data into split-second decisions. Evasive maneuvers are chosen not only for immediate survival, but also to exploit anticipated reactions, reflecting a blend of training, experience, and situational intuition. Subsequent retellings of the incident, particularly in memoirs and squadron histories, gradually shifted emphasis from survival to outmaneuvering. The line between assessment and legend blurred. 12 aircraft became a dramatic number representing existential threat rather than literal counting. This transformation highlights the human tendency to narrativize experience, particularly in environments where life and death decisions leave indelible impressions. Archival analysis demonstrates that the pilot's actions, while exceptional in precision and judgment, did not result in confirmed enemy losses. The encounter's significance lies in risk management, decision-making under extreme stress, and the ability to maintain control within a hostile environment. By surviving, he contributed indirectly to mission continuity, preserving both himself and his escort responsibilities for subsequent sorties. Operational intelligence later incorporated the incident into broader assessments of Luftwaffe behavior. Analysts noted patterns of sequential attacks and overlapping patrol sectors, adjusting bomber routing and escort strategies accordingly. The encounter informed tactical planning without elevating a single pilot's perceived heroism. Yet, as narratives circulated outside operational channels, the story became emblematic. One man, 12 Messerschmitts, survival against impossible odds. The evolution of this narrative underscores the tension between factual reconstruction and the myth-making inherent in memory. Immediate reports prioritize utility, capturing impressions and actionable data. Post-war accounts, filtered through human cognition, hindsight, and editorial framing, often emphasize drama and individual agency. The intersection of these processes produces enduring legends whose roots are historically grounded, but whose details resist definitive verification. Ultimately, the incident exemplifies the interplay of perception, documentation, and memory in wartime. It is not the literal number of enemy aircraft that defines the story, but the complex cognitive and operational challenges confronted by the pilot. Understanding this interplay allows historians to separate extraordinary human performance from embellished narrative, situating the event within the broader realities of aerial warfare in 1943. In examining the broader operational theater, August 1943 marked a turning point in Allied strategic bombing over continental Europe. Fighter escorts were stretched to their limits, tasked with both protecting bombers and engaging enemy interceptors far from bases. Pilots navigated not only mechanical constraints, but also shifting intelligence cues, radio reports, radar readings, and unpredictable weather. Each sortie demanded continuous reassessment of threat and resource, with minimal margin for error. The Luftwaffe's tactical organization magnified these pressures. Fighter wings were deployed in rotating sectors, responding to perceived bomber streams with overlapping but decentralized efforts. Individual pilots rarely witnessed the full composition of attacking forces. From the perspective of a single Allied pilot, successive engagements appeared as a consolidated assault, producing the impression of being outnumbered even when numerical superiority was ambiguous or intermittent. Combat reports and squadron diaries reveal that pilots were trained to prioritize survival over engagement. Avoiding concentrated fire, conserving energy, and exploiting environmental cover were standard practice. The pilot at the center of this investigation executed these principles under extreme stress, maintaining situational awareness while performing precise maneuvers. Success was measured in evasion and preservation of both pilot and aircraft, rather than destruction inflicted on the enemy. Post-war Luftwaffe communications provide partial context for the encounter. Multiple patrols were active in the sector, with intermittent engagements documented. No single report confirms simultaneous engagement of 12 aircraft against one Allied fighter. These records illuminate how sequential attacks, interpreted under pressure, can inflate perceived odds. Human cognition under life-threatening stress naturally interprets cumulative risk as immediate threat, creating enduring misperceptions. The pilot's report emphasizes the procedural over the dramatic. He detailed altitude changes, evasive turns, and momentary separation from enemy aircraft without asserting unverified kills. This methodical record-keeping aligns with RAF and USAAF doctrine, which valued accurate observation for operational intelligence. Yet, when disseminated and recounted over decades, these procedural descriptions were gradually reframed as feats of audacious skill. Understanding the formation of legend requires examining the post-war channels through which the narrative traveled. Memoirs, squadron histories, and popular accounts often amplified numerical estimates for storytelling impact. Isolation from precise operational verification allowed the encounter to be remembered as singular heroism, despite evidence suggesting it was one of many high-risk engagements occurring daily across European skies. The incident also demonstrates the fragility of human perception in aerial combat. High-speed maneuvers, shifting visual cues, and cognitive load combine to produce errors in numerical assessment. While the pilot's survival was real and extraordinary in its execution, the precise count of enemy aircraft becomes secondary to the demonstration of judgment, discipline, and situational adaptation under stress. Operationally, the encounter informed subsequent mission planning. Intelligence officers integrated reports to identify patterns in Luftwaffe behavior, adjust bomber routing, and enhance escort coordination. The pilot's contribution lay in the indirect influence on strategic and tactical decision-making, illustrating how individual actions in complex systems propagate effects beyond immediate engagement. Finally, the encounter underscores the moral and psychological dimensions of survival. Pilots were continuously confronted with life-or-death decisions where rapid judgment determined outcomes. The focus on survival and adaptive reasoning rather than aggressive offense reflects the often overlooked cognitive and emotional labor intrinsic to air combat. Recognizing this allows historians to appreciate the depth of experience that gives rise to both factual record and enduring legend. Decades later, historians examining the sortie place it within the broader framework of Allied air strategy, Luftwaffe deployment patterns, and human perception under extreme stress. The encounter becomes less a question of heroics and more a case study in decision-making, information processing, and the construction of memory. Its endurance in popular consciousness demonstrates how narrative is shaped by repetition, selective emphasis, and the human inclination to simplify complex events. Analysis of Luftwaffe records shows that multiple units were active in the sector, often engaging separately rather than in a coordinated formation. Reconciling these logs with Allied reports clarifies the origin of the 12 aircraft figure. Sequential attacks and fleeting visual contacts were perceived cumulatively, producing an inflated assessment in the immediacy of engagement. The incident exemplifies how high-stakes perception can diverge from operational reality, particularly when events unfold faster than observation can be verified. Eyewitness accounts, while limited, provide further insight. Fellow pilots noted rapid maneuvers, altitude shifts, and moments of temporary disappearance behind cloud cover. No single observer saw all enemy aircraft simultaneously. These fragmented perspectives reinforce the cognitive explanation for inflated estimates. The mind integrates discrete threats into a continuous, urgent impression when survival is at stake. The pilot's debriefing emphasizes methodical evasion, energy management, and exploitation of environmental factors rather than aggressive offense. Maneuvers were calculated to induce overshoot, disrupt enemy firing solutions, and preserve situational awareness. These actions reflect both training and intuitive decision-making, demonstrating that success in aerial combat often derives from discipline and anticipation, rather than sheer skill or audacity. Post-war narratives, however, selectively highlight numerical odds and personal initiative, transforming procedural survival into legendary outmaneuvering. This transformation illustrates the mechanisms by which wartime experiences are codified, mythologized, and transmitted. Repetition across memoirs, squadron histories, and popular media gradually detaches the account from operational reality, reinforcing a simplified narrative that emphasizes individual heroism. Operational intelligence benefited indirectly from the pilot's engagement. His observations contributed to understanding Luftwaffe tactics, influencing bomber routing, escort strategy, and risk assessment. These outcomes underscore the importance of individual reports in collective decision-making, demonstrating how micro-level encounters can inform macro-level strategy, even without resulting in confirmed enemy losses. Psychologically, the episode illustrates the effects of high-intensity stress on perception, memory, and reporting. Time distortion, tunnel vision, and threat exaggeration are consistent features of combat cognition. The discrepancy between perceived and documented enemy numbers does not undermine the pilot's performance. It illuminates the environment in which such judgments are made, emphasizing adaptation and resilience under extreme conditions. Finally, the encounter serves as a lens for understanding the construction of wartime legend. Individual acts of survival are inevitably filtered through organizational reporting, memory, and later interpretation. The endurance of the one pilot against 12 Messerschmitts story reflects human desire for coherent narrative, hero archetypes, and the dramatization of risk, even as archival evidence encourages a more nuanced understanding of reality. The long-term significance of the sortie emerges most clearly when viewed in terms of operational doctrine and cognitive insight, rather than mythic valor. By 1943, the Allies had begun systematically analyzing air combat encounters to refine escort strategies, evaluate enemy behavior, and train pilots in survival tactics. Reports like the one produced by this pilot were valuable precisely because they captured human response under extreme duress, providing lessons that could be codified into procedure without sensationalism. Historians examining Luftwaffe deployments that day note the dispersed nature of the German formations. Sequential interception by multiple units created a continuous threat environment, but not a synchronized attack. This pattern explains why a single pilot might perceive overwhelming numbers and underscores how perception and reality diverge in high-stakes aerial engagements. The episode illuminates broader truths about situational awareness, rapid decision-making, and the challenges of reconstructing aerial combat from fragmented data. The evolution of the encounter into legend illustrates the interplay between memory, reporting, and narrative dissemination. Initial reports focused on tactical evasion and survival. Over time, retellings emphasized the dramatic juxtaposition. A lone pilot, vastly outnumbered, executing maneuvers that confounded the enemy. Each retelling simplified sequences, compressed time, and consolidated multiple threats into a single, tangible antagonist, thereby reinforcing the myth of 1 against 12. From a psychological perspective, the encounter exemplifies adaptive cognition in extreme environments. High-speed decision-making, spatial orientation under stress, and continuous recalibration of energy management all contributed to survival. The pilot's capacity to remain composed while anticipating enemy reactions highlights the complex interplay of instinct, training, and situational analysis that defines effective air combat performance. Operationally, the sortie influenced both immediate tactical adjustments and long-term training emphasis. Intelligence officers incorporated observations into assessments of Luftwaffe tactics, identifying gaps in interception coordination and refining bomber escort doctrines. In this way, the pilot's experience had systemic impact despite the absence of confirmed enemy losses. It demonstrates how individual engagements inform collective learning in warfare, highlighting the role of human judgment as both sensor and actor within broader operational systems. The episode also illuminates the construction of historical narrative. Memory, archival documentation, and post-war interpretation interact to create enduring stories. The story of one pilot against 12 Messerschmitts endures because it resonates emotionally and cognitively, even when verification is partial or uncertain. This tension between evidence and legend offers critical insight into how wartime experiences are remembered, communicated, and mythologized over decades. Finally, the case emphasizes ethical and cognitive dimensions often overshadowed by dramatization. Survival under perceived overwhelming odds requires prioritization, restraint, and rapid moral judgment. Each evasive maneuver represented a calculated choice with potential consequences for self, squadron, and mission. Recognizing these dimensions shifts focus from sensationalism toward understanding the human experience of air combat and the operational realities of strategic decision-making. In the final analysis, the sortie's enduring significance lies less in numerical claims and more in the demonstration of disciplined cognition under extreme stress. The pilot's actions reflect the reality of air combat. Survival hinges on anticipation, energy management, and rapid assessment of dynamic threats. What appears legendary in retrospect often emerges from ordinary mechanisms of human perception and decision-making, intensified by extraordinary circumstances. Archival research confirms that multiple Luftwaffe units were active in the sector, yet there is no evidence of a coordinated 12-aircraft attack on a single Allied fighter. Sequential engagements, fleeting visual contact, and the natural amplification of perceived threat coalesced in memory and reports into a story of overwhelming odds. This distinction underscores the challenge historians face in separating documented fact from narrative accretion over time. The transformation of the encounter into myth also illustrates the mechanisms of collective memory. Repetition across memoirs, squadron histories, and later media solidifies perception into conventional truth. Numbers, once estimated, harden. Sequences of events, once fragmented, coalesce. The story becomes emblematic, less about exact details than about the human experience of facing imminent danger alone. Operationally, the pilot's report informed subsequent tactical decisions. Intelligence officers integrated his observations to refine escort strategies, predict enemy patterns, and enhance bomber survivability. The encounter's value was systemic rather than individualistic. It provided actionable insight, influenced training, and contributed indirectly to mission success, even absent confirmed kills. Psychologically, the sortie demonstrates how stress, rapid decision-making, and situational complexity shape both action and memory. Perceived numerical superiority does not necessarily correlate with actual force, yet it profoundly affects behavior. The pilot's capacity to adapt, anticipate, and execute survival-oriented maneuvers under high-pressure conditions exemplifies the cognitive demands placed on frontline aviators. Finally, the episode invites reflection on the construction of wartime legend. It is a case study in how individual experiences, filtered through perception, reporting, and repetition, can become stories of heroism that resonate far beyond their operational significance. The tale of a single Allied pilot confronting 12 Messerschmitts endures not because of literal truth, but because it embodies the tension between danger, skill, and survival inherent in aerial warfare. Understanding this encounter demands both rigor and humility. It compels recognition of the limits of perception, the complexity of documentation, and the human processes that generate enduring narratives. Above all, it emphasizes that survival under extreme conditions, through disciplined judgment rather than sensational heroics, is itself a form of extraordinary competence. In that truth, legend and reality intersect, leaving a cautionary yet instructive insight into the nature of war and memory.